And that's, I think, one of the scariest things that I've learned over the course of the last 157 years of social media being around. And even more so recently. At 9:15 a.m. on a January morning that would shake the entertainment industry, two sealed envelopes left the headquarters of a streaming giant in California. One was addressed to a court in Los Angeles. The other bore an address that, in recent years, has become synonymous with stability, a sense of duty, and royal continuity. What initially appeared to be a routine administrative procedure turned out to be the prelude to one of the most explosive escalations in the global celebrity world. Netflix filed a lawsuit. The target, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. The amount in dispute, $100 million. The charge, serious breach of contract, systematic deception, a calculated game of prestige without corresponding performance. At the same time, the same company sent an invitation to Catherine, Princess of Wales. 2 letters, 2 worlds. A symbolic break that could hardly have been clearer. The lawsuit marked a turning point not only for the relationship between Netflix and the Sussexes, but for the entire narrative that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle had built since stepping down from the monarchy. Within hours, an ambitious media project had become a legal battle of historic proportions. Netflix made it clear that this was not a matter of creative differences, but rather a structural failure. They spoke of missed deadlines, unclear concepts, repeated rejections, and a glaring gap between promises and delivery. The timing added further weight to the dispute. The accusations were not new, but the formal escalation came with full force. The 2020 contract promised exclusive content, broad reach, and cultural value intended to strengthen the streaming service's brand globally. 4 years later, the ambitious promise was met with only a handful of released content, and its reception fell far short of expectations. Internally, Netflix spoke of a loss of trust, externally, of a necessary clarification. In parallel, a second story began, quieter in tone but no less consequential. The invitation extended to Catherine, Princess of Wales, outlined an educational project focused on heritage, responsibility, and societal benefit. The contrast was striking. While Prince Harry and Meghan Markle surrounded themselves with lawyers and crisis advisors, Catherine became the focus of a strategic realignment. The move was interpreted as a signal, away from conflict-ridden celebrity and toward solid substance. In Monteito, the news caused unease. Reports of internal consultations, frantic phone calls, and mounting pressure circulated. The lawsuit was more than a financial threat. It called into question the credibility of the entire Archewell project. At the same time, Netflix's royal pivot intensified the perception that the company valued reliability and impact, qualities Catherine had embodied for years. The palace reacted with unusual clarity. King Charles II, through a statement, indicated that any collaboration promoting education, the common good, and cultural responsibility was consistent with the mission of the Crown. Without naming names, the message was clear. The institution took a stand, and it did not favor those who publicly sought conflict. The public debate gained momentum. Commentators spoke of a paradigm shift in the way celebrities were treated, of the return of measurable merit as the benchmark. The lawsuit became a litmus test for an industry that had long relied on star power. Now the question was whether symbolism without substance still carried weight, or whether contracts and expectations would regain their importance. By the end of that morning it was clear. It wasn't just about money. It was about credibility, about narratives, about the future of public roles in the digital age. Netflix had drawn a line. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle stood on one side, Catherine, Princess of Wales, on the other. The consequences of this moment would extend far beyond the courtroom. What lessons can the industry learn from this confrontation? And who will define what constitutes genuine impact going forward? The origins of this escalation lie several years in the past and begin with one of the most ambitious media deals in recent streaming history. When Netflix announced its exclusive deal with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle in 2020, it was hailed as a strategic coup. The streaming service was banking on global attention, moral authority, and the magnetic appeal of two names that were then considered the epitome of a modern, progressive new beginning. Expectations were correspondingly high, both internally and externally. The contract envisioned a multi-year collaboration encompassing various formats, including documentaries, series, and programs aimed at a younger audience. Netflix provided substantial funding, coupled with clear development goals, timelines, and quality standards. The model was based on exclusivity and trust. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were granted creative freedom, but also the obligation to regularly deliver marketable content that would meet the company's international standards. However, tensions emerged early on. Internal processes stalled, planned development phases were delayed, and concepts remained vague. While public communication spoke of visionary projects, impatience grew behind the scenes. Netflix invested additional resources, provided its own teams, and tried to stabilize structures that proved surprisingly fragile. The gap between public expectations and operational reality began to widen. When the first productions were finally released, the response was mixed. While individual formats garnered attention, they failed to achieve the sustained impact stipulated in the original contract. Internally, targets were missed, both in terms of reach and production scope. Netflix began to reassess the economic value of the delivered content, while simultaneously postponing further projects indefinitely. With each passing year, the impression of a structural problem intensified. Instead of a continuous pipeline, a patchwork of ideas that never came to fruition emerged. Netflix increasingly questioned whether its strategic gamble had paid off. The answer was sobering. The discrepancy between investment and results became a central theme of internal reviews. At the same time, the tone of the collaboration became increasingly harsh, though this remained largely unnoticed externally. The turning point came when formal deadlines passed unused and planned milestones were repeatedly missed. Netflix was forced to explore legal options. This involved not only lost content but also the fundamental question of contractual compliance. The internal reviews ultimately led to the decision to no longer keep the conflict behind closed doors. In parallel, the media landscape was changing. The market became more competitive, budgets were scrutinized more closely, and streaming services increasingly distanced themselves from prestige projects that did not promise a reliable return on investment. In this climate, the question of reliability took on new significance. Netflix began to realign its portfolio and prioritize projects that combined substance, planning security, and social relevance. It was in this context that Catherine, Princess of Wales, came into sharper focus. Her long-term commitment to educational health and environmental issues was perceived as credible and consistent. Unlike short-term media projects, their work was based on institutional embedding and clearly defined goals. For Netflix, this represented an alternative characterized not by controversy, but by continuity. While Prince Harry and Meghan Markle continued to try to maintain their media position, the contrast grew. The narrative of a new beginning began to crumble, replaced by questions of accountability and results orientation. Netflix faced a fundamental decision: cling to a strained contract or make a clean break that would set new priorities. They chose the latter. This set the stage for the legal action that would follow. What began as a visionary partnership developed into a lesson in expectation management and contractual reality. The backstory shows that the lawsuit did not arise out of thin air, but was the result of a long-standing, simmering conflict. The consequences would only become apparent in the following months, and would have a lasting impact on the industry. As the collaboration progressed, doubts intensified about the feasibility of the original commitments. What increasingly preoccupied Netflix internally was not just the number of productions released, but their relationship to the contractually agreed-upon scope. The gap between the ambitious promise and the actual delivery became the core problem. Internal evaluations noted that the realized formats fell short of the initial promises made at the start of the partnership, both in terms of content depth and production quality. The released projects were emblematic of this discrepancy. Delays, subsequent revisions, and a high need for corrections characterized the development process. Netflix was forced to contribute its own resources to even bring productions to the point of release readiness. This gradually shifted the responsibility from the creative partner to the client. From the company's perspective, this undermined the fundamental principle of the deal, which was based on independent development and reliable delivery. Added to this was a growing uncertainty about future projects. Presentations remained vague concepts, were repeatedly revised, and priorities shifted. For Netflix, this meant planning uncertainty in a market increasingly characterized by efficiency and clear decision-making processes. While other partnerships were making measurable progress, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's portfolio stagnated. The internal evaluation of the delivered content was correspondingly sobering and led to a reassessment of its economic benefits. The financial aspect moved more sharply into focus. Netflix began to weigh the value of the production against the advance payments made. This resulted in a deficit that weighed not only monetarily but also strategically. Missed market opportunities, tied-up production capacity, and growing reputational damage were factored into the calculations. What had been a prestige project had become a risk factor that was increasingly difficult to justify. At the same time, pressure from within the company mounted. Employees reported frustration with lengthy processes and unclear decision-making structures. The collaboration was perceived internally as burdensome, as expectations were repeatedly disappointed. Netflix had to question whether the partnership was still viable in the long term or whether it was freeing up resources that could be used more effectively elsewhere. Public perception also began to shift. The initial euphoria gave way to a more critical scrutiny. Observers questioned why such a lucrative contract had yielded so few tangible results. These discussions intensified internal pressure to take a clear stance. Netflix felt compelled to address not only the financial aspects but also the public discourse. The turning point came when several deadlines passed without substantial progress. Warnings and internal appeals had no lasting effect. From the company's perspective, a line had been crossed. The collaboration had transformed from a creative partnership into a permanent crisis management exercise. At this stage, the legal assessment took center stage, as the conditions for continuation no longer seemed to exist. While Netflix reassessed the situation, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle attempted to stabilize their position. However, the dynamics had already shifted. The question was no longer how to salvage the contract, but rather what consequences should be drawn from its failure. For Netflix, it was clear that continuing as before would send the message that promises were being made without consequence. The decision to resolve the conflict legally was the result of this development. It reflected the assessment that the rupture was not isolated incidents but rather systemic. What began as a creative difference transformed into a fundamental dispute about responsibility and accountability. The case highlighted, for example, how quickly prestige can turn into a burden when expectations remain consistently unmet. At the end of this phase, a sobering realization emerged. The gap between promised potential and actual performance had become too wide to ignore. Netflix prepared the step that would finally bring the dispute into the public eye. The reactions this would trigger were predictable, and the next stage of escalation was not long in coming. With the formal filing of a lawsuit, the conflict reached a new level of escalation. Netflix deliberately chose the public route, signaling that internal mediation attempts had failed. The move was calculated and intended to have an impact. A simmering contractual dispute became a precedent-setting case that extended far beyond the immediate parties involved. The accusations were sharply worded and targeted not only non-performance but a pattern of systematic failures. Netflix's legal strategy emphasized clarity. The accusation was that key commitments had not been met, and that the deviations from the agreed scope of services should be considered not creative freedom, but a breach of contract. The claim, amounting to hundreds of millions of dollars, was interpreted as a signal that the streaming service was unwilling to silently bear the reputational damage and financial losses. Within the industry, the move was seen as a reckoning with a culture of overpromising. On the other side, a period of intensive damage control began. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were forced to realign their public strategy. Reports of crisis meetings, legal counsel, and the involvement of external communication specialists circulated. The aim was to avoid the impression that the situation had spiraled out of control. At the same time, the Sussex's inner circle attempted to portray the dispute as a disagreement over creative standards. However, this interpretation increasingly met with skepticism. The lawsuit painted a picture that corresponded with existing publications and appeared to be supported by internal processes. Netflix pointed to development deadlines and evaluation criteria that had been repeatedly missed. In the public eye, the focus shifted from individual projects to the fundamental question of reliability. The debate took on a momentum that spiraled out of control for those involved. Simultaneously, a counterattack began on a narrative level. Reports circulated about alleged unequal treatment, internal tensions, and missed opportunities that shouldn't be blamed solely on the Sussexes. But these attempts to cast doubt on the situation met with a changed landscape. The market had transformed. Patience had become a scarce resource, and contracts were once again understood as binding guidelines. For Netflix, consolidating its position was crucial. The company emphasized, both internally and externally, that the move stemmed not from short-term frustration but from a long-term reassessment. The escalation was also intended to signal to other partners that commitments were taken seriously. At a time when streaming services were streamlining their business models, the case became a symbol of a tougher stance. The conflict also had political and institutional dimensions. The simultaneous approach of Catherine, Princess of Wales, reinforced the impression of a deliberate contrast. While the Sussexes were embroiled in legal battles, a figure representing stability and continuity came to the fore. This parallel was interpreted by observers as a strategic realignment that extended far beyond a single lawsuit. The discussion intensified on social media and comment sections. The question of whether celebrities enjoyed special privileges or had to submit to the same standards as other contractual partners became increasingly heated. For many, the case became a litmus test of how seriously the industry took its own rules. Polarization increased, but the direction of public sentiment seemed to solidify. At the end of this escalation phase, a clear front line had emerged. Netflix had taken the legal route, thereby institutionalizing the dispute. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle found themselves forced to respond on multiple fronts as time began to work against them. The next phase would reveal whether the conflict would lead to a settlement or escalate further, and what role the newly formed alliances would play. As the legal battle intensified, Netflix simultaneously took a step whose symbolism was hard to miss. The streaming service shifted its focus, deliberately seeking closer ties with a figure whose public perception differed fundamentally from that of the Sussexes. Catherine, Princess of Wales, became the centerpiece of a strategic realignment that prioritized substance over headlines. Observers saw this as no coincidence, but a calculated decision. This so-called royal pivot was interpreted as a response to the experiences of recent years. Netflix sought reliability, continuity, and a clear set of values. Catherine embodied everything the company had lacked in its previous project: long-term commitment, institutional embedding, and a focus on societal impact rather than personal self-promotion. The invitation to participate in an educational project was interpreted in industry circles as a signal that the streaming service had learned from its mistakes. The contrast was stark. While Prince Harry and Meghan Markle faced legal risks and mounting pressure, Catherine presented herself as a calm counterpoint. Her work in education, mental health, and the environment was perceived as consistent and built up over years. Netflix recognized this as a foundation upon which to develop content that thrived not on controversy, but on credibility. Institutionally, the move also fit into a larger movement. King Charles II supported an opening up to formats that impart knowledge and promote social dialogue. The collaboration with a global platform was seen not as a threat, but as an opportunity to convey traditional values in a contemporary way. This created a new narrative that positioned the monarchy not as a mere symbol, but as an active participant. In the public perception, the impression of a change in direction intensified. Commentators spoke of a return to content with measurable benefits. The discussion shifted away from personal conflicts and toward the question of what kind of stories should dominate in the future. Netflix seemed to be consciously choosing to forego polarizing figures and instead focus on long-term relevance. For Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, this move further weakened their position. The royal pivot underscored that Netflix had alternatives and was no longer dependent on a strained partnership. The message was subtle but clear. The market rewards reliability more than mere attention. At a time when trust was already fragile, this development acted as an additional pressure factor. Simultaneously, the tone of the reporting changed. Catherine was increasingly used as a benchmark against which others were measured. Her role was portrayed not as competition, but as a point of reference. This reinforced the impression that Netflix wasn't looking for replacement, but rather a new definition of collaboration. The pivot thus became a statement about values and priorities. For the industry as a whole, this development sent a powerful signal. Streaming services that had long relied on celebrity endorsements began to reevaluate their strategies. The focus shifted toward partnerships that appeared sustainable in the long term. The case demonstrated that reach alone is insufficient without structure and reliability. By the end of this period, it was clear that the royal pivot was more than a byproduct of the lawsuit. It was part of a deliberate repositioning that placed the conflict in a broader context. Netflix had decided to embark on a new chapter. What consequences would this decision have for those involved, and for the future of collaboration between media and the monarchy? The exact nature of the decision remained open, but the direction was unmistakable. As the proceedings progressed, the repercussions, extending far beyond the immediate legal dispute, became increasingly apparent. Netflix's lawsuit evolved into a reckoning with an entire era of media strategy surrounding Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. The focus was no longer solely on contractual details, but on the fundamental assessment of credibility, responsibility, and public impact. The case became a benchmark for an industry that recalibrated its standards. The financial risks came increasingly into focus. The sum demanded represented a potential liability that called into question the entire Sussex's structure. Reports of rising costs, dwindling revenues, and growing uncertainty reinforced the impression that the dispute was taking on existential dimensions. The conflict had escalated from a creative difference into a legal and economic test. At the same time, the reputational damage intensified. Public perception shifted further in favor of Netflix, which presented itself as the guardian of contractual standards. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle found themselves increasingly on the defensive. Attempts to reframe the debate lost their impact, as the facts were perceived as damaging. The impression that expectations had been systematically unmet took hold. Institutionally, the gap widened, with the monarchy signaling unity and a clear prioritization. King Charles II made it unequivocally clear that commitment, duty, and substance would be the guiding principles for future public projects. Catherine, Princess of Wales, became the central figure in a new narrative that emphasized continuity and social responsibility. This contrast intensified the Sussexes' isolation. For Netflix, the case was more than just a legal matter. It served as a signal to the market that high-profile names do not supersede contractual obligations. The escalation was deliberately accepted in order to set a precedent. In a period of consolidation, it was meant to demonstrate that partnerships must deliver measurable results. The company positioned itself as an actor that learns from its mistakes and is not afraid of consequences. The public debate reflected this development. Commentators interpreted the case as a censure in the handling of celebrity. The question of whether attention alone was sufficient currency was increasingly answered in the negative. Instead, concepts such as reliability, sustainability, and impact moved to the forefront. The conflict became a symbol of a paradigm shift in the media landscape. At the end of this chapter, a sober assessment was presented. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle faced a host of legal, financial, and reputational challenges as Netflix and the monarchy solidified their positions. The dispute demonstrated how quickly narratives can shift when expectations and reality diverge. It exposed the limitations of symbolism without substance. The outlook remained uncertain, but the direction was clear. Regardless of the legal outcome, the case had already had an impact. It had shifted standards, redefined priorities, and raised the question of how public trust is earned in the digital age. Will this conflict serve as a cautionary tale or mark the beginning of a stricter era of accountability for celebrity figures? The conflict between Netflix and Prince Harry and Meghan Markle represents more than a typical contractual dispute. It symbolizes a fundamental shift in how celebrity power and responsibility are viewed in the global media industry. What began as a visionary partnership gradually evolved into a clash over reliability, performance, and the limits of symbolic capital. The lawsuit made it clear that big names alone are no longer sufficient to justify long-term collaborations. At the heart of the escalation was the growing discrepancy between ambitious promises and actual results. Netflix felt compelled to draw a clear line and send a signal to the market. The decision to take legal action was not merely a reaction to financial losses, but an expression of a new self-image. Contracts apply even to high-profile partners, and non-compliance does not go unpunished. This made the case a precedent for an industry in flux. In parallel, the royal pivot to Catherine, Princess of Wales, revealed a strategic realignment. Netflix consciously prioritized stability, institutional embedding, and societal impact. This decision intensified the contrast with the Sussexes and underscored the growing importance of credibility and continuity. Supported by King Charles II, a new narrative emerged, positioning the monarchy as an active and responsible actor. For Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, this development meant a double burden, both legally and reputationally. Public perception shifted, and attempts to regain control of the narrative met with limited success. The case demonstrated how quickly narratives can change when expectations are not met. Ultimately, an open question remains that extends beyond this specific instance. Does this mark the beginning of a new era in which public figures are judged more on measurable performance, and what will future partnerships look like under these altered circumstances?